Not everybody knows how valuable a HELOC is. It is honestly one of the greatest financial tools, I think, that exists when used properly. Hopefully Santa brought you everything that you wanted. Steve, what do you want Santa to bring you? Do you need another Harley? Is that what it is?
Well, that was the very first thing that came to mind. If you look at my shirt today, I am wearing
Davidson shirt.
I am wearing DFY colors here, which are reminiscent of Harley colors. But no, I am sadly not getting another Harley. I think 2 is plenty.
Okay, yeah, 2 is going to be enough.
Love those.
Right.
Hey, so what I'm getting for Christmas is we're visiting our family out in Pittsburgh. We're going to hang out for a week. We're going to do a bunch of fun things. Get to roughhouse with my 4 grandsons. And so, that's awesome. That's about as good as it gets.
That is as good as it gets. And listen, if you're going to go to Pittsburgh, I need you to do something for me. I need you to not become a Steelers fan. Can you do that?
I can do that.
Good, because the Steelers, not that they're competitive with the 49ers necessarily this year, but the Steelers have 6 Super Bowl rings and the 49ers have 5, and it's been a quest for 6 for a long time. So by default, I must hate the Steelers.
So does San Francisco have a shot this year?
Oh, yeah. They probably have the best shot. I haven't been
following, football at all this year.
They probably have the best shot in the NFL, honestly.
Okay.
They are absolutely amazing. And so if any of our listeners out there are like, you know what, Kev, we appreciate your guys' content so much. We want to send you to a 49ers playoff game. I just want everybody to know, I'm open to receiving that gift.
You are a generous person.
Listen, I'm generous, but I'm willing to let others be generous as well.
Yeah.
Because one of my favorite books.
That's a unique quality.
One of my favorite books is called The Go-Giver, and the 5th principle in The Go-Giver, it's like the principle of stratospheric success is to be an effective giver, you have to remain open to receiving. And so I am remaining open to receive playoff tickets and airfare, and I'm even cool if you want to throw in a hotel and maybe some walking around money. Is somebody out there? If you want to do that for me, I'm willing to accept it.
Well, Kevin, I wasn't gonna spill the beans on this, just yet.
Okay,
but I do have a special gift for you for Christmas.
You do? Oh, good.
And it may or may not include an NFL football game.
Okay, I highly doubt it will, but if it does, I'm going to be real thankful. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We're excited to be here, and we have kind of a cool topic today. This is one that maybe we've kind of mentioned, but I think that there is a real reason to talk about it, and one of those reasons is, Steve and I, Steve, as you know from the podcast, if you've listened, he references things that he reads a lot. Steve, you do a lot of research, a lot of industry, whatever, and I just play on it on social media. And so, but on social media, there is an influencer. That's what we're going to refer to this person as, a real estate influencer, okay? And he did a video recently that you and I got a little bit of a chuckle out of, and we thought, just in case, because he's fairly well followed, in the real estate space, we thought, just in case there's somebody out there, maybe even one of our listeners who saw the video and they think, wow, this sounds like this magical thing. We thought, let's actually talk. It is magical, but let's talk about it in terms of, I don't know, what's that word we like? Oh yeah, truth and reality. And so those are 2 words, not 1, but we're going to talk a little bit about
3 words.
It's okay. Well, fine. Count the and. All right, Mr. Number Cruncher over here. So we are going to talk today about something sometimes referred to as a HELOC, which stands for what, Steve?
Taking equity out of your property and using it for other things. So
that's right.
Your personal residence, sometimes, it's hard to get a HELOC on an investment property. It's almost impossible to get a HELOC. But for a personal residence, totally doable. And it's kind of like, having money in the bank, in the bank of your house.
So this particular video we saw was sort of talking about HELOCs, which, by the way, for those of you that don't know, stands for Home Equity Line of Credit. That's what a HELOC stands for. So every time you hear us say HELOC, what we're saying, we're just lazy to say Home Equity Line of Credit. So it's a HELOC. And in this video, this influencer was like, he's like, you could get a free HELOC on your house and you could turn $50,000 into $4.3 million. Now, granted, there was no math of how one would do that. There's no time frame. But what was so interesting is he made it sound like a HELOC is just this free thing. He's like, you just go to the bank and they just give you a credit card for the equity in your house and it's free money. All right. So what we thought we needed to do, because not everybody knows how valuable a HELOC is, it is honestly one of the greatest financial tools, I think, that exists when used properly. And so we thought, let's dive into what is a home equity line of credit? How does it work? How can you leverage it? How can you use it? How is it applicable in a couple different ways? We'll talk a little bit about how would you go and get a HELOC and just use it as sort of your basic investment capital to go and get an investment property, and what would be some of the cautionary things that you would need to be aware of if you were to do that. We're going to talk about how can you utilize a home equity line of credit to become, we talk about this on the podcast and in the book, we talk about having a sleep well at night account, which is really just reserves for your property in the event that there's a repair or there's a vacancy or something like that. So how do you use a HELOC to acquire real estate? How do you use a HELOC to be your sleep well at night account? And then we'll touch on a strategy that maybe is not right for everybody, but there are companies that utilize this strategy really well. And it's something that I personally have utilized that I'm a really big fan of, and I've nicknamed it Moneyball Banking, and because I'm utilizing Moneyball principles with my HELOC in order to get myself ahead to invest in additional real estate. So we are going to touch on all of that today, all things HELOCs and home equity lines of credit. And so let's start with this, Steve. So if somebody wanted to consider getting a home equity line of credit, what are some of the things that they would need to have in place in order to qualify to go to a bank and to apply to get a home equity line of credit?
So the very first thing that you would need to have is a house, a home that you've purchased. And
is that why they call it a home equity line of credit?
It is.
So the house is sort of necessary?
Yes.
Thank you.
So the very first thing.
Glad we unlocked that one.
Got to have a house, got to own it, got to have your name on title, all that good stuff.
Yes.
Right? So number one, that. Number two, you have to have owned it long enough, or the market has to have done its thing such that there is equity, meaning, let's say you bought the home for $100,000 and over the course of several years, it went up in value to say $150,000. And so the home is worth, $150,000. So you got $50,000 in equity, right? Yep. And I'll just point out that sometimes you can borrow up to 100% of the value of your home.
Yep.
Other times, depending on different things and the bank that you're utilizing, it could be something different than that. It could be 75%, 80%,
My
whatever.
home equity line of credit that I personally utilize went up to 80% equity on my home, right?
Nice.
But Adam, who is one of our coaches, has utilized very prolifically home equity lines of credit that go up to 100%. So the terms can change, and it just kind of depends on what bank you're going to. But yeah, so there are variations. But you point out something that I mean, maybe it just seems like no duh, but it's really important. I was talking to a buddy of mine who I was kind of telling him what we were doing from a real estate standpoint. He knows a little bit about what we do. And I was talking about how I'm utilizing a home equity line of credit as just part of my overall real estate strategy. And he's like, man, that sounds awesome. Could I do that? And I went, well, maybe. Now, he bought a newish townhome 1 or 2 years ago. And I was like, what did you buy it for? What do you think it's worth? And I was like, well, you could go get a home equity line of credit, but it's not going to be enough to really do much for you to go and acquire real estate. So that is really key. I would say this, in general, if you're listening and you have owned your primary residence for at least 5-ish years, right? It could be, let me qualify that. There's a chance that if you bought it like during COVID with a significant down payment, that you would also maybe be okay. But I would just look at, you want to have enough money in equity that would be enough for an average down payment on a property if we were to utilize it with Moneyball Real Estate, which would mean you would want to have, let me give you some math, right? Let's say, I'm going to have to pull out my calculator. Let's say that you have a home that is worth $500,000, okay? If it's worth $500,000, just to be safe, let's see, what would 80% of loan to value be? That would be $400,000, okay? So if you had a home and your remaining mortgage balance was anywhere around, 325 or below, probably 300,000 or below. So if you bought a primary residence, it's worth 500,000. You don't have a current home equity line of credit on it, and your remaining balance on your 30-year fixed mortgage or whatever you have is 300,000 or less. There's a really good chance that you could leverage a home equity line, assuming that you have decent credit and that your home's you have this equity in reality, and your debt to income ratio isn't crazy to where, if you've got 1,000 different car payments and your debt to income ratio is way out of whack. So, but if you have about that kind of an equity amount in your primary residence, that may be enough for you to investigate getting a home equity line of credit and being able to potentially utilize it as a source of a down payment on an investment property. And again, this would be your primary residence that you'd largely be looking at. It's fairly difficult to go get a HELOC on an investment property.
Yeah. So you asked me what things you need in order to get the HELOC. So we identified you got to have the home. It's got to have some equity in it. You talked about you got to have good credit because that will play a part in the interest rate that you'll be charged. Oh, interest rate.
We should probably talk about that.
Which means that it's not quite free.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, interesting. So that influencer said that it was free, but there's an interest rate?
Yes. So it's
weird.
free if you don't draw on it.
Oh.
So the and it may not even be free then because sometimes they'll charge points.
Sometimes they'll put, or they'll put a fees on the home equity line right
itself,
off the top.
Potentially.
Yeah.
It just depends. So potentially it is free if you don't use it. But and that's one of the cool things about a HELOC is that if you're not using it, usually you're in pretty good shape. There's no expense, incurred. But if you utilize your HELOC, say you pull some money out like you suggested to go use it as a down payment on another property, then there is a cost to the capital that you end up pulling out.
That's right.
So if you have $100,000 available to you, you pull out $85,000. If your interest rate, for easy numbers, is 10%, which is kind of a common number right now for a HELOC, and it's typically interest only.
Yep.
So easy calculation. So 10% annually. And if you use $85,000, that'd be $8,500 per year. Mm-hmm. Divide that by 12, and that gives you your monthly payment. And that's your cost of capital for that property.
$700 a month.
About $700. Yeah. So that's one of the things that you have to take into account when you're going to use that money to purchase a property, because you need to add that into the cost, your monthly cost of owning that property.
That's right. Now, and let's address that real quick. So let's say that I were to go through this process, right? Let's say that I've got $275,000 of a balance on my mortgage. My home is worth $500,000. I find a home equity line of credit company. Now, by the way, you could look for HELOCs at credit unions are good places to look. There's local credit unions. There's national credit unions. You could go to like a large national bank. They will offer HELOCs. They probably advertise it. They may or may not have really good rates. If you can find it, like a lot of times Steve mentioned, there is a draw period on a HELOC, right? So a lot of times, depending on the terms, and this is why if you're considering utilizing a HELOC, one of the best things you could do is call up, and this is what I always recommend people do, call up multiple banks in your area, credit unions, and just ask them about their terms. So before I got a HELOC, that's exactly what I did. And I found a bank that had been recommended to me that after reviewing their terms, I was like, this is going to be the best for me. Now, they would only lend up to 80% of the equity on my property, unlike other banks that would have gone up to 100%. But they had a 10-year draw period, meaning I could pull money in and deposit money. I could make payments into and pull money out of up to the balance of my HELOC for 10 years. And during that 10-year draw period, it was going to be interest-only payments. Now, what would happen is after that initial 10-year draw, whatever remaining balance there would be potentially on the HELOC just gets amortized into effectively a 20-year loan, right? Like a 20-year fixed loan based on the interest rate. Now, here's the other thing about interest rate that everybody needs to be aware of if you're looking at a HELOC. So Steve mentioned 10%. The reason he said that is because interest rates are higher now. A lot of times these home equity lines of credit, they connect their interest rate to like an index, right? There's these various financial indexes, mortgage indexes, like the LIBOR or whatever, and there's also this thing in lending called the prime rate. Like there's all of these numbers that you don't have to worry about what they are. Just know the bank or the credit union is going to tie your interest rate to some sort of an index. And as that index moves up, meaning when interest rates generally across the board go up, you'll see that index increase, which will then adjust your interest rate. So it's not quite like a credit card. It's not compound interest, right? You're paying interest only on a simple interest calculation that will eventually become a 20-year amortized loan. There's a lot of jargon, but
if you don't pay it off.
If you don't pay it off, if there was a remaining balance after that drop period. So the idea, ideally, right, is you have a 10-year drop period, you're interest only, use the money, get that thing paid off using your real estate if possible during that time frame, so you're not, adding what effectively is this just straightforward second mortgage. So the interest rate can adjust. There can be an interest-only period. There may be a drop period. Some banks will give you like a debit card or like a card that's attached to the HELOC. My bank doesn't do that, right? So I have to jump through a few more hoops, but I don't mind because it's all, very straightforward stuff. So in general, like Steve said, you've got to have equity. You've got to have good credit. You have to find a bank that has terms that you're willing to accept. But when we come to interest rate, now that we talked about the fact that it can fluctuate, the other thing you have to realize is if I were to, in our scenario, go get a home equity line of credit to go buy a property, we know right now, Steve, that mortgage interest rates, even though they're coming down, right? We've seen mortgage interest rates, even on investment properties, come down, maybe like more than 1% or so now, right? Somewhere in, but we're still doing, rate buy downs, which can help to increase cash flow. But you may not be cash flow positive a ton on an investment property, which means if I incurred a $700 payment on my HELOC and I'm only cash flow positive on my property, let's call it $200 a month for simple math, I have a $500 deficit between what I'm generating in cash flow on my investment property and what I'm owing every month on my HELOC. So what should one do? Does it make sense if you are quote unquote going negative or it feels like you're making an additional payment? Does it make sense to own real estate on a HELOC? And my answer would be, and I want to get your opinion on this, my answer is it depends, right? It totally depends on what your financial situation is and what your long-term perspective is. What would you say? Would it make sense for somebody to do that?
Your answer was exactly right. It totally depends. So if you're in a scenario where you're younger, you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, and you've got, a 20, 30-year window before you're planning to retire, it can make total sense, right? People put $400, $500, $600, $700, $800 a month into a 401k on a monthly basis, and they're just simply putting that money away. Right. It's a similar kind of a concept. You have a great way to explain that. I think you've maybe done it before on this podcast.
Talking about negative cash flow and making investment contributions to your retirement.
Yeah, because over that same period of time, the value of the home is going to go up sufficiently. The depreciation expense that you get to write off, the principal pay down, all those things can negate completely that negative immediate monthly cash flow situation, right? Yeah. So yeah, the answer totally depends. And you just have to take a look at your situation. Now, one more thing that I would point out in terms of, HELOCs are not free, is there are even situations where a bank will promote an initial interest rate. Yeah. For the first year, it will be, half price. Yeah, so it'll be 5%.
Yep.
But at the end of 1 year, it goes up to a predetermined amount, which was, the prime plus whatever their fees are. And so that 5% rate could go up to 8%.
Yeah.
It could go up to 10%, whatever it is, whatever the contract says. And so you have to be aware of that so you can account for that. If you're planning to hold a property for 5 to 7 years, you need to calculate into that reality, right? The reality check that your payment could go from that $700 a month to, $950 a month.
Now, let me tell you the way that I kind of look at it personally, right? So if I'm going to go and get a HELOC, which I've done, and I'm going to go and invest in real estate, which I've done, and I know that perhaps the cash flow that I'm generating from the real estate I own is not going to offset whatever my monthly payment might be on the HELOC. You could just look at it in simple terms and go, well, wait a second. I have $200 a month cash flow. I'm paying $700 a month HELOC. I'm quote unquote negative or making payments of an additional $500 of what effectively is just interest to the bank on the HELOC, right? Would I want to do that? But this is the way, now this is just for me. I look at it in this sense. Number one, and I would say this is good, this could be applicable to a number of you listening. If you've been dying to break into real estate, and you're like, I don't know how I'm going to get into real estate. I don't have time to go and save $100,000, or I don't have the ability to pull it out of my 401k because I'm with a current employer and I love the contribution match, and so I don't want to get rid of my 401k. And you're going, I have to break into real estate. What could I do? This may be an option. Maybe you go get a HELOC. Maybe you are quote unquote negative or making another $500 of interest payments on top of the $200 that you're getting, in quote unquote cash flow, however you want to look at it. But I look at our properties and I go, but what is, because I'm looking at it from the long term, right? If my finances are such that just based on what I'm earning income-wise, plus my real estate, plus what other business ventures I've got going on, if I can handle that sort of $500 gap without it sort of affecting my standard of living, it means a couple things. It means, number one, I can get into real estate sooner than I otherwise would have. Number two, if I've got room on that home equity line of credit, that also becomes my sleep well at night account, meaning if there's a repair, if there's a missed payment or I have to evict a tenant, I'm not having to necessarily keep that money in reserve in a savings account where I'm not touching it, where it's earning next to nothing. Instead, I've got it sitting in my home equity line of credit, and if I need to access and pull it out, it means that the next month's payment, my interest-only payment, may go up slightly, but for me, there's a margin of safety in keeping it in the home equity line of credit. Now, in addition to that, I look at our properties and I go, I'm going to own this for the long run. What's my average monthly increase? Which is a number we've talked about on this podcast. We talk about it in the book. We love this number. Average monthly increase is something that over the long-term ownership of the property, over a 10-year time frame, when you take a look at all the financial benefits that you're getting from real estate, which is principal paydown, cash flow, depreciation, so tax benefits, and appreciation. If my average monthly increase on a property is like $1,200 a month over that time frame, and I'm going to temporarily, because I may only have to utilize my home equity line of credit temporarily on an investment property. I don't even know if I'm going to own it for the full 10 years, but if my average monthly increase is well above what my sort of additional expense is to own that real estate by utilizing a HELOC, I'm still in a positive position over the long run, and frankly, far more positive position, because if I just use that HELOC to get that first investment property and that's all I ever use it for, am I making a sacrifice potentially for the first few years? Sure, that's what one would be doing. But if it means that you now own a property and that property can grow in equity and provide some growth that could then be a gateway to you owning your next property and those owning your next properties after that. This is why we're talking about it, because this may be a way for somebody out there listening who has no idea how they're going to get into real estate, but they listen to Replace Your Income. They love Moneyball Real Estate. They've wanted to go and invest in real estate, whether with us or somebody else, and they're going, I have no idea how I'm going to break in. Here is potentially a way, based on your scenario, that you could justify it from a mathematics standpoint, from a money and reserve standpoint, from a how am I going to pay for it standpoint, assuming that your financial life is in your house is in order. And if it's the gateway to allowing you to owning that first property, all of a sudden now, that first one is always the hardest. You're knocking down that domino. Just like last week's podcast, we talked about Barbara Corcoran, who said that first one is the key, and then you hang on to it till it's fat and juicy. So that's one of the reasons why we like the HELOC. It's not for everybody. What you shouldn't do is you shouldn't go get a HELOC that you can't afford to buy real estate that you can't afford. And then you're turning around and you're looking at us and you're going, wait a second, my property cash flow isn't offsetting my HELOC payment. And now I'm totally screwed. I can't meet my other obligations. And now you lose it all. That is not a thing you should do at all.
The other thing, and there's probably one thing even worse than that. And that is if you don't have some form of self-discipline, you should not be getting a home equity line of credit, because you will end up spending it on consumer type items. There's another, social media, I'm not going to call him a social media guy, but, a talk show host that specializes in financial matters, and super, super conservative, a lot of really great principles. But I feel like in some areas overly conservative.
Yeah.
But the reason for it is because he doesn't trust people to be wise and smart with their resources.
Yeah.
And so if you don't trust yourself,
if you're not disciplined
to utilize the HELOC for the right things that are appreciating assets and investment type purchases, then you're probably better off not getting it, because you will go and you will spend it. You'll get that stereo. You'll buy that thing that depreciates in value, or you take it out of the store and it's now worth half what it was. You definitely don't want to use a HELOC for those types of things.
And there are some good mentalities and some good companies that can teach you how to use a HELOC to kind of accelerate debt pay down, right? Which we don't have time to get into it too much today, but here's just the general idea, just so everybody kind of knows, because it is an idea that's floating around out there. There are some guru and influencer types that kind of talk about this. We've worked with some amazing companies that really advocate this idea, and I think it's pretty, if you're disciplined, I think it's really powerful. And it's this idea, okay? And I'll just give it to everybody super high level, because it would take a long time to sort of understand, maybe not, but it's this. Let's assume that I have a HELOC, okay? Let's assume that I buy an investment property, okay? Now, let's assume that I also have room on the HELOC to consolidate or to chunk down other debt that I have, whether that's a car or on a depreciating asset, or whether, it's credit card debt, or whether it's other real estate that I have that I want to accelerate and pay off. We have some clients that have done this really powerfully and accelerated their pay down on existing investment properties utilizing this methodology. If you look at the home equity line of credit as your sleep well at night account, your source for down payment, and a liquid resource for you to be disciplined in paying down other debt that you maybe acquire in your life, this is kind of the way that would work. So you've got this money that's there. If you were to take every shred of income that you get, right? All of your rents, all of your income from work, all of your spouse's income, all of the income that you generate, and you were to take that and make it as large chunk payments on your home equity line of credit, right? Thousands of dollars a month of payments on your home equity line of credit, then to turn around and pull out just what you need from the home equity line of credit to meet your bills, right? So let me give you an example. Let's say that somebody makes $10,000 a month, but they've got, let's call it $5,000 a month in bills, okay? If you have a home equity line of credit and part of the balance on the home equity line of credit may be the money you took out for the investment property, maybe, consolidating some credit cards or something like that, potentially paying off some cars or whatever it is, maybe your sleep well at night account, if it's liquid and available, and you say, I generate from all income sources, including my rents, I generate $10,000 a month. That means, and that's what you're taking home. If you're making a $10,000 a month payment onto the HELOC, but then you're turning around and just pulling out $5,000 in order to meet your bills because that's what your obligations are, what you're doing is you are chunking down the principal, meaning you're paying less interest, which compounds over time and giving you the liquidity. And here's the other thing. If I'm generating $10,000 of income and I'm making that as a payment onto the HELOC, it's effectively satisfying the payment requirement that I have every month on the HELOC. I still have to pay the interest, right? But it's just I'm making these large deposits. And what happens is you start to free up capital by being disciplined. And over time, let's say you free up more money on the home equity line of credit. You could even take a chunk of that and pay down your primary residence and then throw all the income you're generating back onto the HELOC until you've got liquidity, and you could pay off your primary residence in an accelerated time frame. You could pay off your investment properties in an accelerated time frame, all because you're utilizing this thing that's not free but can be utilized as a financial instrument or tool. And that's why I like to call it Moneyball Banking, because it's a different way of banking, right? You're utilizing a home equity line of credit. You're utilizing your income. You're utilizing property income. You're using it as a sleep well at night account. You're using it to maybe pay down other obligations that you have. It's providing liquidity that you wouldn't have otherwise. You are paying interest, but if your financial life is such that you can make it work and you're willing to work a system like throwing all your income on it, and you look at the properties that you're investing in, and your average monthly increase is well above what sort of that potential gap would be between what you have to pay on the HELOC and what you're generating in income. All that could mean, Steve, is you may have access to something that gets you ahead a little bit sooner than you otherwise would. And that's, I think, what I hope everybody gets from the episode. Number one, HELOCs are not free, okay? I don't care how many followers or likes or comments somebody has. If they tell you a HELOC is free, they are lying to you straight up, okay? Or they are trying to mislead you to sell you something, but they're not telling you the truth, okay? That's number one. And then number two, there are ways to utilize it. And one of the things that we're going to be doing that I'll just tease here is once the book launches, we're also going to be launching a community that provides sort of additional ongoing education on topics for people that maybe aren't yet ready to do real estate. And there's going to be an entire section on this concept of HELOCs and Moneyball Banking and how one would utilize that. So get ready, everybody, because it could be something that could be really effective. We've seen it work. I've seen it work personally. I have many people that I've worked with that have utilized it successfully. I also know many people that have not used it in the right way and have gotten themselves into debt trouble. So just like anything, you need to be careful and you need to be wise. Any other thoughts before we wrap this HELOC episode, Steve?
Yeah, no, I think you got it covered, Kev.
Thank you for listening. We love you. If you haven't rated and reviewed the podcast, we'd love for you to do it. And also, again, if anybody is thinking, gosh, Kev, thank you so much for the knowledge bombs you dropped. I want to take you to a 49ers game. I'm open, okay? Just throwing it out there. I'm okay with it.
All right.
Put it on your HELOC. I'm just kidding. All right, everybody. Have an awesome holiday season, and we'll talk to you real soon.
Merry Christmas.